Welcome back to the Topwater podcast. I'm Justin Ellis, and I'm the host of this podcast, and I generally just sit down and talk a little bit about fishing, either talk about techniques or what happened on the water or something like that, just kind of just shooting the stuff with just about fishing, just that's kind of what I do. That's what I love doing. It's my passion, and I'm trying to share it with you guys and gals. So just to kind of get into the podcast today, I'm actually going to be talking a little bit more about, or just kind of going in depth a little bit about the Texas rig, which is generally the rig that I just find a lot of versatility into it, and I find that it's really kind of, it's one of those rigs that I think that it's good to kind of get the feel of it as a beginner because of how versatile it is, and it's a very simple setup. The setup, all it is a bullet weight. You can use lead weight, you can use tungsten, and a hook and a soft plastic bait, and that's literally it. And the way you can fish it, you can fish it as just a chuck out and retrieve, like if you had some sort of swim bait that you were trying to fish around cover or something like that, but you don't have any sort of weedless option. You can put a bullet weight at the front of your hook and, peg it. I would generally peg it. You could probably not peg it to give it a little bit different of action, but that's kind of going into like the weeds a little bit. I would probably peg it so that way the weight's just right there at the front, and it just kind of gives the same action as you would with like a swim bait jig head instead of a non-pegged weight, because what the peg does is keeps the weight from sliding up the line. So as you're retrieving it, the weight will stay right there at the hook, and it will actually, just stay there. And if it's not pegged, what happens is the weight will fall first, and then it'll hit a point to where then it'll start pulling the bait down. So you get kind of a little bit of a free fall action before it starts going down. And then once the weight hits the bottom, then the momentum of the bait will actually start to slow down, due to the resistance in the water. But, that's just more of a like a preferred, what do you prefer as far as like fishing goes, or what type of action you're trying to give it. But you can do that. You can actually just chuck out and retrieve it. You can cover water as far as like covering the bottom, because a lot of the times anytime you use like any of the bigger sort of type of worms, or like maybe like a brush hog or something, like you're coming over a point, you can actually use the Texas rig to kind of cover that whole point. So you'll chuck it out past the point and then retrieve it over it. Generally you'll stay along the same depth. I mean, you could change it to where it comes down the depth. You could get closer to the bank to where it comes up. Just whichever way the bass are kind of like situated into looking for bait. If it's something to where they're like the sun's shining, water levels are kind of the same, clear skies, they're probably more likely to be more face down than they are up, just because, they don't really have eyelids or anything like that. And a lot of the times they'll situate themselves in places to where, they're pretty well camouflaged. So, it's a good way to cover water, as far as, like a big worm, something like that, like a ribbon-tailed worm during the summertime. That's a good choice. Also with, and generally what I use the Texas rig for is to fish laydowns, grass, heavy cover, lily pads, that sort of thing, to where sometimes you'll want to like pick a piece of cover apart. So let's say, for example, you have a laydown that is sticking out from the bank. It's in the water, trees falling down. And the way I kind of approach it is with a Texas rig with a pegged weight. because the reason why you want to peg the weight is you don't want the weight to go over the branch and the bait to go on the other side, because sometimes it'll get twisted up in there, you'll get hung up on stuff, or you'll pitch in there and the weight will fall in the wrong spot and the bait won't get down to where you need to get it down, in order for the presentation to actually work. So generally when I'm fishing heavy cover or I'm fishing cover at all, I'll tend to peg the weight rather than to leave it unpegged. So that way the weight's not, going up the line and messing up my action and messing up my presentation. But generally the way I fish it when it comes down to cover is I'll start on the outside and then work my way in. So that way, if for some reason I do catch a fish or something on the outside, it'll still give me a chance to catch the fish on the inside. Because just because you catch a fish on the outside of it doesn't mean all the fish are just necessarily going to spook. What I've actually seen from a lot of the footage of like underwater shots that people do on YouTube and other things like that is generally what will happen is a fish will get caught and it just causes the other fish to kind of turn and look. So they'll get curious about it. And they don't just necessarily spook. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So it's a good practice to start on the outside and work your way in, because a lot of the times you can pick one or two bass up out of a certain piece of cover. Also, with the Texas rig, the great advantage of it is it's weedless, so you don't really have to worry about it getting hung up all the time. And when it does get hung up, it's generally the weight getting hung up into something, and it's a lot easier to get out because it's not like the hook is like burying itself into like a piece of wood, and you're having to like drag up a piece of wood from however deep it is. But that's the nice thing about the Texas rig. It's fairly weedless as far as like weedless goes. I really don't get it hung up a lot, and a lot of my bigger fish have actually came off of that rig right there. Well, at least the bigger fish, as far as like I've had more success with bigger fish with the Texas rig than I have any other rig. The underspin's been pretty good, but it seems like it just catches like all sorts of size. I mean, the Texas rig does too, but I'm able to fish where bigger bass may actually be and specifically target that sort of spot, And that's what that's, in my opinion, that's where it really shines. It really shines when you're fishing cover, and it shines when you're fishing like grass and punching into grass or lily pads or something like that. Another good way to use the Texas rig is what I like to do is I like to take either like a Rage Menace, a Rage Bug, or one of those Bama bugs or something like that. And on lily pads, especially when they're grown up, what I'll do is I'll generally fish it with a frog to try to get strikes. But a lot of the times I've found that sometimes that frog doesn't quite work just because they'll come up and hit the pad and they won't get the frog. Maybe because the bass isn't big enough, or maybe it's just, it's trying to push it off the pad and into the little holes that are in between the pads. But most of the time, what'll happen is that'll happen, and I'll have to toss back in there with something else. And generally, I'll use a Texas rig with a weight on it. Usually, like a 1/4 ounce weight. I don't need something necessarily really heavy because I'm not punching through cover, because I'm bringing it up to the hole and letting it drop. And with that smaller weight, it's going to drop a little bit slower than if it was like a 1/2 ounce weight, because I generally use a 1/2 ounce weight when it comes down to punching into grass and stuff. Sometimes, if it's a little bit deeper grass, if I know it's deeper grass, I may go to an ounce just to really just punch in there. But a lot of the grass that I've been coming across has been fairly shallow, so I haven't been really pushing it far down or really deep, because a lot of the times I notice with that ounce, it just flies past them and buries itself in the mud. like almost consistently, and I had a real issue with it. So I haven't been fishing with an ounce weight in a little while, but the half ounce has just been money for me as far as like, getting it into the grass. Sometimes you have to like jiggle a little bit and like fadangle it in there, but it kind of is what it is. It falls a little bit slower, but it does get caught up a little bit more because it doesn't have the weight to pull it through that grass. But I seem to have more success with it. And it seems to be that half ounce weight seems to be a little bit more versatile because I can fish it around different pieces of cover without actually changing out, without cutting my line and changing the weight out. If you have multiple rods, you could have multiple setups, but, I'm fishing with one, basically punching stick, and that's about it. So if I ever want to change weights, I got to change out I got to cut my line and retie and the whole 9 yards. So the half ounce weight is generally the way I go when it comes down to punching, when it comes down to just, getting in there like that. But it's a very versatile technique, and there's a lot of baits out there for it. You have, like I said, you have ribbon-tailed worms, you have straight-tailed worms, you have all your swim baits, which you can hook up with a Texas rig. You can use like finesse worms. You can use, stick baits, any sort of like creature bait. I'm pretty sure like 99% of baits out there are rigged up on could be rigged up onto a Texas rig. All it just really depends is the size of weight, size of hook, size of line, and whether or not it's pegged or not. Now, when it comes down to line, I generally go with a fluorocarbon. That's generally the way I like to go. Now, if you're fishing cover, you may think about using some sort of braid leader or just straight braid. I know there's a lot of people out there that use just straight braid when it comes down to punching, which is not a bad way to go because you get a pretty decent amount of sensitivity. There's not a lot of stretch, so when you whack them, it's there. There is the whole issue of like if there's water clarity and that sort of thing, but generally, if you're punching in a cover, you're usually not worried about any sort of visual presentation because it's going to be a reaction bite. They're not going to stop and look and be like, what is this? And then bite it. Sometimes they do, but the majority of the time it's just in, bam. And then you're off to the races and you're pulling in a bass. So you got that going on. Now, if you're not really necessarily fishing cover, I would go with a fluorocarbon. And the pound test is really just kind of dependent on, where are you fishing? What's your water clarity? You can usually get away with like 12 to 15 on your lighter setups. If you're fishing around a lot of cover, I would go 15 to 20 pounds on your fluorocarbon. And I generally fish Seagar. So far it's been the fluorocarbon that's just seemed to just do the trick for me. I've had a lot of and here's the thing, it's like I have had a lot of success with it, and I haven't had a lot of breakages with it. So it's actually gotten to the point now to where I need to change it out because the color of the fluorocarbon is all nice and milky because it's just been on my reel for the past year. And I haven't had too many issues with it. I mean, because it's been on my reel for so long, I have had backlash issues with it, but it's time to switch it out because I've been fishing with it all year. So, I mean, as far as like fluorocarbon goes, when I started fishing fluorocarbon, I was under the impression I was going to have to be changing this stuff out like once, twice, a month, and not, and that's something I don't want to do because it's expensive. It's expensive to change out your line every single month. But when you're talking about a fluorocarbon that lasts for quite a while, and I'm still catching fish off of this, in the last video that I shot, I was fishing off the same line I was fishing with a year ago, and I was still catching bass. So, and maybe I'll catch more bass if I had changed it out and it's not so visible, but, the water's a little bit stained, so I wasn't really too worried about it. I was just worried about whether or not it's going to break, And of course, if you're catching a lot of fish or something like that, you go ahead and just change out your knots, cut your line, change your knot out, just so that way as you're not burning through that knot. Because, the more fish you catch on it, the more stuff you hang up into it, the more cover that you're fishing with it, you need to go ahead and just cut it and retie. It's one of those more of a, better be safe than sorry sort of things, rather than just letting it go. You're like, I'll be fine. I'll be able to get through it the rest of the day. And, sometimes you can. I've done that, to where I haven't cut my line and retied in a day or two. But generally, before I go out each day, I always cut my line and just retie. Every single one of my lures, whether it's fluorocarbon, mono, generally not the braid. Braid, I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about changing out my knots, especially normally if I have braid on a rod. It's one or two things. It's either like a 10, 20 pound test. Yeah, just generally anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds, but that's usually like on my spinning reels. I'll put 10 to 20 pounds, generally because I want that sensitivity in that rod. I want to be able to feel it. And then I'll do some sort of either fluorocarbon or mono leader, something like that, in order so that way is, there's some sort of clear line on it that I don't have to necessarily, worry about the fish seeing. So that just kind of helps with the presentation. And there's a lot of great videos out there for leader connections. But as far as like the Texas rig, generally when it comes down to line and the weight that you should be throwing, it's going to come down to the amount of weight that you're putting onto the line and the size of the hook. Because the size of the hook is actually really going to matter, because the bigger the hook, the harder it is to actually, puncture the fish and actually get the hook in there. Because if you really kind of think about it, it's like taking a very, very fine needle and like a turkey baster needle. Like, which one's going to be easier to poke? And it's going to be the fine needle, because the fine needle is much thinner. It's going to take a lot less pressure for that thing to actually be able to pierce. And so that's kind of the way I just kind of look at it and justify it, because it's just going to take way less pressure for those smaller hooks. So you don't actually have to like really force a hook set. And if you set your drag properly, get it to where it's enough to where the hook's going to come out of the bait and into the fish, but not so much that it's actually going to snap your line. And that's just something that you're just going to have to play around in your reels. And your cheaper reels are going to be harder to do because it's just cheaper material. Your more expensive reels are going to be a little bit better at this because, they're more expensive, more quality, parts onto your reels. And it's just, it saves a little bit more hassle. And of course, there are the happy mediums, your more like your $100 price range reels that really they do what they're supposed to do. They do, exactly what you need them to do, and that's really the way to go. Now, when it comes down to rods and reels, generally most of the time when I'm fishing a Texas rig, it's generally on a bait casting reel, and you could fish it on, if you're fishing a lighter setup, you can go with like a medium heavy, possibly a medium. I would say that's kind of pushing it, but you could totally be fishing it on a medium rod. I would probably go with like either a moderate fast. I wouldn't go too soft, just because you want you want a little bit more backbone into it, but you don't necessarily, like on your lighter setups, you don't want it to be too heavy. Like you don't want too much resistance to it, because then you're just putting more pressure onto the line. If you're using thin line, thinner diameter line, lower pound test, that you want the rod to be able to absorb a lot of that energy from the hook set. So that way you're not putting too much tension on the line, breaking your line, because you don't need that much tension. You don't need that much. You don't need the whole hook set when it comes down to, that sort of style of fishing. If you're talking about a more finesse presentation of the Texas rig, you don't need, I mean, you can even throw it on a spinning setup. It just, like I said, it just all depends on the type of bait you're fishing and the water clarity that you actually are fishing. So, and then it just goes up from there to, just a broomstick. If you're punching heavy cover, a long rod, heavy, fast action, that's what you need, and that's what I fish. I fish a heavy, fast action. I mean, it's not as long as some people that would, there's some people that would disagree with me and say that you would need a longer rod than a 7-foot rod, but a 7-foot rod, no, mine's 7.3. I have a 7'3", faked black 13 fishing rod, and I don't have too much of an issue with that. I really don't. Now, I mean, it does just mean that you're not really necessarily able to flip as far just because your pendulum point's a lot closer to you. So those longer rods, those 7-11 rods that a lot of people like to fish as far as, flipping goes, those are going to be a little bit easier to use when it comes down to like flipping cover that's a little bit further away from you. You're going to have a lot easier time just dropping it in. But the shorter rod, it works for me because it fits in my car nicely, for one thing. That's really nice. It fits in there. It also, since I'm in a kayak and not in like a boat or something, having super long rods kind of makes it a little bit more of a hassle, because then you got rod tips constantly sticking off the end of your boat. And that kind of, you can break rod tips if you run into something, because you're drifting around constantly. There's no stopping you from drifting. So you got that sort of stuff going on. And I just find the 7'3" just kind of works for me. It does what I need it to do. It may not be the thing that a lot of experts will sit here and go, this is what you need. It's like, well, yeah, kind of, but you can also get away with something else. You don't necessarily need exactly the exact same setups that everybody else has, especially if you're fishing, places to where a 7-11 rod would actually start really just inhibiting you from actually being able to make cast. If you're up against like trees and stuff like that, you have to be so far away, and then now you're really just trying to get it up underneath there, and it could just be more of a hassle and more difficult. It just depends on what you're fishing. And it just depends on what you specifically are trying to do. So really just the rod and reel setups, it's just, I would go generally with a bait casting rod, casting setup. And if you're talking about fishing heavy cover, fishing heavy cover, fishing lily pads, fishing grass, fishing laydowns, stuff like that, I would 100% go with a heavy fast action rod. And as far as reels go, I would try to get a reel that has a fairly high gear ratio, just because you want to be able to catch up with them. You want to be able to pitch in there, and as soon as they start pitching, as soon as they hit that bait after you pitch, you want to be able to just reel down to them as quick as possible. Because they don't just grab the bait and just sit there. They grab the bait and start moving. So if they start moving inside that cover, they're going to maze your line around a whole bunch of different stuff, and you got to set your hook through that. So that sometimes lends it to be a kind of a sticky situation, because then, like, the best thing you could do is to get that bass up to the surface and out of that cover, because you don't want to fight that. You don't want to fight that fish inside the cover. You want to fight that fish in open water. That's where you're going to have the best chance of actually catching the fish. So you want to get them out of the water, out of that cover as quick as possible. And the best way to do it is to come out the way you came in, because other than that, because I had a situation at one point, I was fishing and there was lily pads, and I was tossing, and I was getting this bass to bite almost every time at my frog, but it wouldn't quite get the frog. It would sometimes get it, but most of the time it would just hit the pad and, pop it off. But I was pissing this bass off. So what ended up happening is I pitched, after there was just one more time I just pitched out there, and I had an underspin tied on my other rod. Now, this isn't a Texas rig story, but this is crucial to what I'm talking about as far as like having the right equipment, because this is the time that I didn't have the right equipment. This is one of those times where I kind of just first started, so I really didn't know too much about like what I was doing. Well, I knew what I was doing, but I kind of didn't. You know, I was kind of in that weird in between spot to where I knew how to fish, but I was still kind of learning some stuff. I was still making a lot of like pretty amateur mistakes. And one of the things I did is I pitched in there. Well, I had a spinning setup. It was just a medium heavy rod, which is it's not a very flimsy rod, but it's definitely not going to be the type of rod to where you can just muscle a fish out of some heavy lily pad cover. It's just, it wouldn't be the rod for that. I would have to let it kind of work its way out of there. Now, what ended up happening is I threw my underspin on the other side to where I knew the bass wasn't. And I worked the underspin over the top of the lily pads until the bass came up and hit that lily pad. And I stopped it. And then I pulled it along and I let it drop in the first hole where that bass was. And when it did, it smacked it. And I set the hook, and that bass took off to my right. Now, when it took off, I could have sworn I would have lost that bass, because then it got hung up into the lily pads. Because, of course, at a certain point, it's just going to run out of room to run, because everything's just going to pull tight and it's just going to sit there. Well, luckily for me, it had enough room to play to where it couldn't get leverage on the hook to be able to rip the hook out. So it never got leverage on me, but one of the things I had to do is I had to maneuver myself through the lily pads and over to the fish, because I had to go to the point to where I was hung up in order to undo that in order to get to the fish. I could have went straight to the fish, which probably would have been a little bit better idea. But I was kind of thinking, like, I don't want to break my line. I want to get my line off of this as quick as possible, so that way this fish doesn't break my line, because it was a decent-sized fish. Well, I get to the fish finally. Now, if you've ever tried to go through lily pads, and I'm not talking like little dollar lily pads, I'm talking like full-blown lily pads. If you've ever tried to maneuver through that in a kayak, it's not easy at all. It's a lot of hard work just to get over there. And I was worried that I was going to lose this fish. I finally got over to the fish. I pulled it up, and it ended up being like a 3-pound bass. I was ecstatic that I didn't lose the fish, but it was a very valuable lesson that I learned, is that you have to have the equipment to fish the cover that you're fishing. Because if you're fishing open water, you can get away with a lot lighter equipment because there's not as much stuff for that fish to get into. And if you're fishing heavy cover, you have to have heavy-duty equipment. That's where stuff like braided line, if you're going to fish braided line anywhere from, I would fish no less than 50 pounds. No less. And 50 pounds is even pushing it. Like 50, 55, 60, 65, somewhere right in there, it's probably going to be good. A lot of people say 65-pound braid, 65-pound braid. That's generally what a lot of people fish. And I think 65-pound braid is great. It might be a little overkill, but if you're talking about fishing heavy cover, overkill is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe you get a little bit less bites, but 65-pound braid, you're coming out of there. You're going to pull up whatever you caught, So that's just kind of where it is. So it's really, when it comes down to Texas rigs, just remember, as far as like bait selection, if you're covering water, you're going to be using more worm style baits. If you're punching cover, you're going to be using more like creature sort of style baits, your shorter sort of styles like your rage crawls, your bama bugs. And like I said, if you're covering water, you're going to be using more worm sort of style baits like ribbon-tailed worms, straight tail worms, Senkos, that sort of type of category. But yeah, it's just really just kind of think about what you're fishing, what the type of fishing you're going to be doing, what the fishing in the water, your water clarity is going to be. Because if you have clear water, you're going to want lighter line. If you have dingy water, you can just have as heavy line as you want. Go for it. I mean, there might be you don't need 80-pound fluorocarbon. I don't even think they make it that heavy. They might, maybe some saltwater stuff. I have no idea. But yeah, that's really what it comes down to. You just kind of have to figure out what you're fishing, what you're going to be fishing around, and just kind of adjust accordingly. But that's the nice thing about the Texas rig, just because it's pretty versatile. You can fish it however you want. And actually, here's another little fucking tip, is what you could do is you could actually use a Texas rig like a jig. Like, it works the same as a jig, essentially. Now, it may not have the same actions as certain jigs do, because a lot of your jigs will have specific style of heads in order to be able to give it a specific sort of action. Like a football head, for example, has more of a standing up action when it comes up to cover and stuff. So a lot of times it'll hit a piece of cover, and as you're trying to pull it over, it'll stand up. You got flipping jigs, and you got swim jig heads. So, that's all a whole different video segment. But what you can do is you can actually take a punching skirt and stick it on your line in between the hook and your weight. And then all of a sudden, now you have a weedless jig presentation. So if you're on a really decent jig bite and you're coming up to some cover, instead of throwing that jig in there with the weed guard and taking your chances, you could just throw a punch skirt on there, and boom, you got yourself a weedless jig, essentially. And that's pretty much it. I kind of really glossed over a lot of it. Kind of. I didn't really go like super, super in depth, just to kind of keep this, shorter, just to kind of blow through it. But hopefully this has been a little bit informative for you guys and gals. So that way is you guys can go out there and do some fishing with your Texas rigs, and maybe get some ideas of what you can actually do with it, and actually kind of take some of the stuff that maybe I've said and maybe some of the stuff somebody else said and put your own thing together and figure out your own way to fish Texas rigs. And that's pretty much it. It's a nice versatile rig, and it's a staple to keep on your boat or kayak or whatever you're fishing on. If you're fishing off the bank, it's also really good for that, because guess what? It's weedless. Weedless stuff fishing off the bank it helps. It helps a lot. But yeah, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this thing up, and I hope you guys and gals have had a good time, because I'm having a good time too. And I'm going to probably go out and rig up some rods and get ready for tomorrow and do a little bit of fishing myself, and probably do a little bit of filming and seeing what I can get on film and start working on the next little project. I'm probably thinking I might do a video on, since I'm doing a podcast on Texas rigs, I might just do a video on Texas rigs. So I don't know. It's really kind of up in the air. It's really just kind of whatever the fish kind of really choose, per se, because a lot of it's just me fishing and getting shots, and then kind of basing the video around the shots I get from me fishing. So that being said, I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to get moving on this stuff, because I'm burning daylight. And if you're burning daylight, that means night's going to come, and that means morning's going to come even sooner. So that being said, I'm going to get out of here. I hope you guys get out on the water, because it is fun. It is actually starting to warm up. It is actually starting to be summertime now. It's kind of been ridiculous. It's been winter, summer, spring, winter, spring, summer, winter, spring. It's been crazy weather. So that's one thing, and I'm looking forward to getting out on the water. I hope you guys are looking forward to getting out on the water, and I hope you guys have a great Father's Day weekend. All you fathers out there, happy Father's Day. Yeah. So, with that being said, I'm going to get out of here. You guys have a great day. I'm having a great day. I'll see you guys out on the water. Peace.